White judge finds black woman only to learn she's a federal prosecutor. They thought they were dealing with just another case. A corrupt judge, a black woman caught in the crossfire of the system, and a routine courtroom scandal that could be swept under the rug. Judge Samuel Hayes was no stranger to the game. For years, he'd wielded his power from behind the bench, playing by the rules that kept the wheels of justice turning and his own pockets full. But when he decided to find a woman who seemed like an easy target, something inside her snapped. He never imagined that Chloe Jennings, the quiet, determined woman before him, wasn't just another defendant, but a federal prosecutor with a deep connection to the very system he'd manipulated for years. Chloe's life had always been about patience, precision, and playing the long game. But when Judge Hayes tried to break her, to ruin her career with a judgment meant to silence her, she revealed a side of herself no one had ever seen. Hayes had thought he could control her, but he was wrong. She wasn't just some powerless figure in his courtroom. She was his undoing. As Chloe's past came to light, Hayes' perfect world began to crumble. The lines between good and evil blurred, and Hayes realized just how deep the corruption ran. The case that started with a small injustice soon exploded into a conspiracy so vast, so far-reaching, that no one, not even the most powerful in the city, were safe. But as Chloe's investigation into Hayes' life grew more dangerous, someone else was pulling the strings from the shadows. A mysterious network of powerful figures who had been orchestrating everything from the start. No one could be trusted. No one was truly safe. Now, with her career and freedom on the line, Chloe must decide. Fight for justice and expose a corrupt system, no matter the cost, or walk away knowing that the very people she's up against will stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The world is closing in around her. The risks are higher than ever. And Hayes, the man who thought he controlled everything, is about to learn that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who bring you down. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Judge Douglas Hayes stared at the woman standing before him, her eyes unwavering as the courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. He adjusted his glasses, then slammed his gavel down with an authoritative thud. "I hereby fine you, Ms. Thompson, for contempt of court. The amount will be substantial, and you have no right to challenge this decision." The courtroom gasped. The judge had made his ruling, and it seemed final. But then, just as the last echoes of his gavel faded, a sharp voice cut through the room. "I'm a federal prosecutor, Judge, and I'm about to make sure your ruling gets reviewed by people who are far beyond your reach." The judge's face flushed with confusion, then anger. A federal prosecutor. This woman, with her defiant stance and determined eyes, was not who she seemed to be. Ms. Thompson's lawyer, who had been quietly sitting beside her, looked at her in shock. His face paled. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," she said slowly, "that I don't think you want to deal with the consequences of your mistake. You're about to find out just who I am." Her words sent a ripple of tension through the room. The courtroom murmured as the judge sat frozen, staring at the woman in disbelief. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a federal prosecutor to step into a local courtroom, let alone take on a sitting judge. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, until Judge Hayes finally broke the silence. His voice was cold, but his hands shook slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. "You think you can intimidate me, Ms. Thompson? I am the judge here. You will follow the law or suffer the consequences." A chill ran through the room. No one had expected this. They'd all thought this case was just another routine matter until now. Then, with a sudden, startling calmness, Ms. Thompson stepped forward and placed a single folder on the judge's desk. "Let's make one thing clear, Judge Hayes. I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here to remind you of who I am. And trust me, you don't want to find out the hard way." The judge's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the folder. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Before the judge could speak, Ms. Thompson turned and addressed the courtroom, her voice now rising with authority. "As of today, I will be filing a formal review of this case. I can assure you, Judge, this fine you impose will be under investigation, and I'm the one leading it." The judge's face twisted in confusion. The thought of a federal prosecutor coming after him in his own courtroom was an affront to his power, his authority. No one had ever dared challenge him like this. The tension in the room was palpable as the door to the courtroom swung open. Several uniformed officers walked in, one of them carrying a large stack of papers. "Federal authorities," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Judge Hayes, your ruling is being suspended pending review. Ms. Thompson's request has been granted." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The room erupted into whispers, but the judge remained silent, his mouth open in stunned disbelief. His mind raced, trying to piece together the events that had just unfolded. Ms. Thompson didn't wait for him to respond. She turned to leave, but not before one last pointed remark. "We'll see if you still have your seat after this, Judge. You may have overestimated your power today." The judge's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He watched her leave, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And then, just as the door to the courtroom closed behind her, a realization hit him. He had no idea who this woman really was. The events leading up to that shocking moment had all started weeks before. Ms. Erin Thompson had never planned on becoming a federal prosecutor. Her dream since she was young had been to become a defense attorney, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But life, as it often does, had a different plan. Erin had grown up in a small town in the southern part of Georgia, raised by her grandmother, who was a school teacher. From a young age, Erin had been taught the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. Her grandmother had always said, "Never back down when it comes to justice. If you see something wrong, you make it right." After graduating from law school, Erin found herself working for a firm in Atlanta. It wasn't glamorous, but she loved the work. As a young attorney, she was known for her determination, her ability to think on her feet, and, above all, her fierce commitment to justice. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of the federal prosecutors, who recognized her talent and offered her a position that would change her life. Erin had never looked back. She had worked her way up in the federal system quickly, becoming one of the most respected prosecutors in the country. But despite her success, she had never forgotten her roots. She had always believed that the law should protect everyone, not just the powerful or the wealthy. And that's why she found herself in Judge Hayes' courtroom that day. The case had started innocently enough. Ms. Thompson had been representing a client who was wrongfully charged with a crime he didn't commit. The trial had dragged on for weeks, and Erin had done everything by the book, fighting for her client's innocence at every turn. Judge Hayes, on the other hand, seemed to have his own agenda. It was clear he wasn't interested in justice. He was more concerned with maintaining his own power and reputation. He had made several questionable rulings throughout the trial, and Erin had caught him on more than one occasion bending the law to suit his needs. One day, during a particularly heated exchange, Judge Hayes had ordered her to sit down and stop speaking. He had fined her for contempt of court, accusing her of interrupting the trial, even though Erin knew she had done no such thing. It was in that moment that she had decided enough was enough. No one, not even a judge, was above the law. Erin had never been one to back down. She had spent years fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let this man get away with his corruption. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hayes was left alone at his desk, still reeling from what had just happened. He knew he had to take action, but what? He had never faced a challenge like this before. What did a federal prosecutor want with him? He took a deep breath and looked at the stack of papers that had been brought into the room. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that his own fate was now in someone else's hands. Was his career truly over? The courtroom doors slammed open, and two men in suits walked in. One was tall, dark-haired, and stern, while the other was shorter, with glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "Judge Hayes," the tall man said, his voice grave. "We need to talk." And with that, the game had begun. Judge Hayes felt his heart skip a beat as the two men stepped into his courtroom. The air in the room thickened, and for the first time in his career, He felt an unfamiliar sense of unease. The man who had spoken, tall and imposing, fixed him with a hard stare. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a typical visit. "Who are you?" the judge asked, his voice low, trying to mask the nervous tremor that threatened to reveal his true feelings. The taller man smiled coldly, then nodded to the shorter one beside him. "I'm Special Agent Harris, FBI," the man said, his tone professional yet tinged with authority. "And this is Agent Cruz." "FBI?" Hayes' voice echoed in the room, disbelief thickening every word. "What's going on here?" "This is my courtroom." Agent Harris didn't flinch. Not anymore. Not with the federal review in play. Ms. Thompson's request is being taken very seriously. The room felt even colder, as if the walls were closing in on him. Hayes felt a wave of panic creeping up his spine. He'd never been in a situation like this. He was a judge, a man of power in his own courtroom. No one ever questioned his authority. But now it seemed everything was changing, unraveling before his eyes. "What do you mean? A federal review?" Hayes stammered, his confidence wavering. "I've been a judge for over 20 years. I'm beyond your reach." Agent Cruz, the one with the glasses, stepped forward, his face emotionless. "Not anymore, Judge. It seems you've made a serious error in your ruling, and now it's our job to investigate. Ms. Thompson is filing formal complaints about your conduct in court, your decisions, and the way you've handled cases in the past. And frankly, we've been reviewing your case long before today." Hayes froze. He had heard whispers, rumors of judges being investigated, but they were always about others, never about him. The thought of his actions being scrutinized by federal agents was an unimaginable blow to his ego. "You're accusing me of corruption?" Hayes asked, voice rising. "We're not accusing you of anything yet," Agent Harris replied, his voice like ice. "But there's enough evidence to make this a very serious matter." The judge swallowed hard, his mind racing. What had he done? Was this all just because of that fine he'd imposed on Miss Thompson? Could she really be behind all this? Erin Thompson. The name echoed in his mind, and for the first time he realized just how dangerous this woman really was. She wasn't just any attorney. She was a federal prosecutor, a force that could dismantle everything he had worked for. If she was bringing in the FBI to investigate his conduct, he was in trouble. Real trouble. "Why are you doing this?" Hayes asked, his voice more desperate now. "She's just one lawyer. Why bring in the FBI over something so small?" Agent Harris leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "It's not just about her, Judge. We've been following the pattern of cases you've handled. There are multiple complaints, more than you'd care to admit. But Miss Thompson's involvement has pushed things over the edge. She's serious about exposing what's going on here." The weight of his words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He could see it now, the pieces falling into place. Erin had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now everything was about to come crashing down. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Hayes muttered, almost to himself. His mind raced to find a way out, some way to stop this, but the agents before him stood firm, unshaken. Agent Harris studied him for a moment, then spoke again, his voice laced with warning. "We have the paperwork to halt all your cases, Judge. You're not above the law. So if you think you can just brush this off, think again. You'll be held accountable for your actions." For the first time in his career, Hayes felt completely powerless. The man who had ruled over his courtroom with an iron fist now realized that his control had been an illusion all along. Meanwhile, Erin Thompson sat quietly in her office, her hands folded in front of her. The phone buzzed on her desk, an unfamiliar number. She picked it up on the third ring, her voice calm and composed as always. "Miss Thompson." "Yes," Erin replied, already knowing who was on the other end. "This is Special Agent Harris from the FBI. We're proceeding with the investigation into Judge Hayes." Erin's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. "I thought so. What's the status?" "We've just had a meeting with him. He's not taking this well." "I didn't expect him to," Erin said, leaning back in her chair. "But it's necessary. He's been getting away with too much for too long. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I don't need to remind you, Miss Thompson, that this could turn into something very big. If the judge decides to fight back, things could get messy. Erin's expression hardened, her resolve clear. I know exactly what I'm doing, Agent Harris. This is bigger than just one man. It's about justice, and I'm not backing down now. If he thinks he can use his position to intimidate people, then he has no idea what's coming for him. You're sure about this? Harris asked, his voice cautious. I'm sure, Erin replied firmly. Make sure you do everything by the book, and I'll handle the rest. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hayes was left to grapple with the gravity of his situation. As the federal agents left, they made it clear that they would be back soon, and that he needed to prepare for what was coming. His eyes lingered on the pile of documents left on his desk. Federal paperwork, investigative reports, the very same reports that now hum over his head like a guillotine, ready to drop at any moment. The room seemed to close in on him. His world was crashing down and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hayes had built his career on being untouchable. But now for the first time he was facing the full force of the law. It wasn't just Erin Thompson who was against him anymore. It was the entire federal system. And there was nowhere to hide. He had no choice but to prepare for the fight of his life. As he sat there, contemplating his next move, the courtroom doors opened once again. This time it was a different figure. A man in a suit, holding a briefcase, looking nervous but determined. He stepped forward hesitantly. Judge Hayes, I need to speak with you. The judge looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. What now? The man cleared his throat, then said the words that made Hayes' blood run cold. I'm here to represent you, Judge. The federal investigation is moving forward, and you're going to need all the help you can get. At that moment, Hayes realized something that sent a shiver down his spine. He was in way over his head. And things were only going to get worse. Judge Hayes stared at the man who had just entered his courtroom. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified that someone had finally come to offer their help. The man looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly combed. But his nervous posture, his tense hands clutching the briefcase, gave Hayes the impression that he wasn't dealing with an experienced lawyer. He was dealing with someone who was just as out of their depth as he was. You're here to represent me? Hayes asked, his voice cold, still trying to process the situation. The man nodded, but he hesitated before speaking again. Yes, Judge Hayes. My name is Robert Kane. I've been asked to assist you in navigating the federal investigation. I have experience in these matters. Federal investigation? Hayes repeated, his eyes narrowing. You think I need help with this? I've been a judge for 2 decades. I don't need some outsider coming in here and telling me what to do. Kane took a deep breath and set the briefcase down on the desk with a soft thud. You're going to need someone who knows how to handle the feds, Judge. It's not just about defending your rulings anymore. It's about your entire career, and possibly your freedom. Erin Thompson has made this personal, and the FBI is taking it very seriously. Hayes clenched his fists, trying to fight the panic that was building inside him. He had been in control of everything for so long, his courtroom, his reputation, his life, but now it felt like it was all slipping away. I'll fight this on my own, he said stubbornly, though he knew deep down that wasn't an option. Erin had already set the wheels in motion, and now the FBI was involved. The stakes had been raised beyond anything he could handle alone. Kane gave a small, knowing nod. You can, but I don't recommend it. These things tend to spiral, and once they do, they don't stop. The feds have already gathered enough evidence to go public with their findings. If you don't cooperate, they'll pull every thread until everything you've worked for is gone. Your job, your reputation, your future. The weight of the man's words settled on Hayes like a heavy stone. He had never once imagined his career could be at risk, especially not because of a case involving a single attorney. But now the realization was sinking in. Erin Thompson had set a trap for him, and he had walked right into it. I know you don't want to hear this, Judge, Kane continued, his voice steady but firm. "But you're not going to win this fight by being stubborn. You need to show the feds that you're cooperating. If you don't, they'll destroy you. It's that simple." The judge didn't respond at first. His mind was spinning, but one thought kept repeating over and over in his head. "This is bigger than I thought." Finally, after a long pause, Hayes spoke. "All right, what do I need to do?" Kane's eyes lit up as if he had been waiting for Hayes to ask that very question. "First, we need to start by controlling the narrative. The more the public knows, the harder it will be to handle. If we can keep this quiet for now, we might have a chance to sort this out before the media gets wind of it. Secondly, we'll need to gather information on the case Erin's working on, the one that brought this all to light. We need to understand her strategy and anticipate her next move." Hayes nodded slowly. He wasn't thrilled with the idea of cooperating, but he saw no other option. If Erin Thompson could bring down a powerful figure like him, what else could she do? The threat was real, and he needed all the help he could get. Meanwhile, Erin Thompson was sitting at her desk, flipping through a stack of legal documents when her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen, her eyes narrowing as she saw the name. It was a message from Special Agent Harris. "We have confirmation. Judge Hayes has hired counsel. He's preparing for a fight. You need to be ready for what comes next." Erin's lips curled into a tight smile. She had anticipated this. Hayes would try to fight back. He wasn't going to let her expose him without a struggle. But Erin wasn't about to back down now. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let a corrupt judge like Hayes get away with his actions. She set the phone down and stood up, pacing the room. Her mind was sharp, focused. This was no longer just about winning a case. It was about sending a message. If Hayes thought he could simply lawyer up and survive, he was mistaken. She had the federal system on her side, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," she called, quickly returning to her seat. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Agent Cruz. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "We've got some new developments. The judge has hired Robert Kane. He's a defense attorney with a solid track record. But from what we can tell, he's not the type to back down from a fight." Erin raised an eyebrow. "I'm not worried about Kane. If anything, his involvement only makes this case more interesting. It's clear Hayes knows this is serious. He's already looking for ways to protect himself." Cruz nodded. "We'll need to stay one step ahead of them. Our investigation is moving forward, but we'll have to be strategic. If Hayes fights back too aggressively, he'll force us into a corner. That's when the media gets involved. Once the public knows about the investigation, it could get ugly." Erin leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Let it get ugly. The public needs to know what kind of man Hayes is. We'll use the media as leverage. If we expose his corruption, we'll destroy his credibility, and the people will demand justice." As the day wore on, the atmosphere in Judge Hayes' chambers grew more tense. He sat at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the legal documents Kane had brought in. His mind was still racing, still trying to process the enormity of what was happening. His phone rang, cutting through the silence. "Hayes," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Judge Hayes." A voice on the other end said, smooth but cold. "This is Aaron Parker from the federal prosecutor's office. I need to schedule a meeting with you as soon as possible. It's about your case. We need to discuss the ongoing investigation and how you plan to cooperate." Hayes clenched his jaw, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had known the call was coming, but hearing it out loud made the situation even more real. "I'll be available tomorrow morning," he said, trying to sound confident despite the fear gnawing at him. "Very well," Parker replied. "Expect us at 9:00 a.m. I suggest you prepare yourself." As the call ended, Hayes sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in disbelief. His worst fear was becoming a reality. He was being dragged into a federal investigation that threatened to destroy everything he had built. And Erin Thompson, she had planned it all. For the first time, Hayes began to truly understand the gravity of his situation. This wasn't just about a fine or a small mistake. This was about a woman who had the power to bring him down, no matter how high his position had been. He had underestimated Erin Thompson, and now he was paying the price. Erin, meanwhile, sat quietly in her office, staring out the window as she waited for the next step in her plan. She had set everything in motion. The federal investigation, the public exposure of Hayes' corruption, the growing pressure on the judge, everything was coming together. But there was one thing she still didn't know: what Hayes would do next. Would he cave in and cooperate, or would he fight back harder than she anticipated? She didn't know, but one thing was certain: whatever happened, she was ready. And she would win. The morning of the meeting arrived with a heavy sense of inevitability hanging over Judge Hayes. His stomach was tied in knots as he prepared himself for the conversation that could very well be the beginning of the end. Erin Thompson had set the wheels of this investigation in motion, and now it was out of his hands. The only question left was how far he would be willing to go to save his career, and whether he could even control his own fate anymore. Hayes was pacing in his chambers when Robert Kane arrived. The defense attorney stepped into the room, his briefcase in hand, his expression tight. "Judge, we need to be sharp today. The feds will try to pressure you. They're not going to play fair. But remember, we have the law on our side. They can't just accuse you of corruption without evidence." Hayes grunted but said nothing. Kane had been insistent on playing this smart, not giving anything away. But Hayes could feel the walls closing in. The fact that federal agents were already circling like vultures made him realize just how bad things had gotten. The knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Hayes called, straightening his tie as if that would somehow make him feel more in control. Two men walked in. One was tall, with sharp eyes and a stern face, while the other was slightly shorter but just as intimidating. Hayes recognized both of them immediately. Aaron Parker, the federal prosecutor, and his assistant, who had been quietly taking notes during their phone conversation the previous day. Parker wasted no time. He gestured for the others to sit down, and without waiting for anyone else to speak, began. "Judge Hayes, thank you for agreeing to meet with us this morning. I won't waste your time. As you know, you're currently under investigation by the FBI, as well as our office. We have reason to believe that you've been making rulings that do not align with the law, and we need to discuss how you plan to address this." Hayes' mouth went dry. He forced himself to sit up straighter, but his mind was already racing, trying to think of something, anything, to say in his defense. He had always prided himself on being fair, unbiased. Yet now everything he'd built seemed to be crumbling in front of him. "I've done nothing wrong," Hayes replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "I make decisions based on the law, and that's all. If you have specific complaints, then present them. But I will not stand here and be bullied into admitting something I didn't do." Parker remained unfazed. He glanced at his assistant, who handed him a folder filled with documents. "We've reviewed your case history. Your decisions in recent months, particularly those involving Ms. Thompson's cases, have raised red flags. We've also looked into other cases you've handled. There's a pattern here, Judge." Kane stood up suddenly, his voice firm. "What pattern? You've got nothing concrete. This is a witch hunt." Parker's eyes flicked to Kane, but he didn't flinch. "Your client's attempt to deflect the truth won't work here, Mr. Kane. The law is clear. The judge's behavior is under review. You're free to disagree with the facts, but they're not going away." Hayes sat back, his head spinning. Aaron's influence seemed to stretch far beyond what he had imagined. Parker's words, subtle but forceful, made it clear that the prosecutor's office wasn't just investigating one isolated incident. They were looking at everything. "I'm a judge. I follow the law," Hayes repeated, but it sounded more like a plea than a statement of fact. Parker leaned forward. "Then you'll have no problem showing us how your rulings align with the legal framework. We'll be watching closely, Judge. Every move you make from here on out is going to be under scrutiny. If you cooperate, we can work this out. If you don't," he trailed off, letting the silence hang between them before finishing. "Let's just say you don't want this to go public." A cold shiver ran down Hayes' spine. He had always thought he was untouchable, but now, for the first time, he realized how easily the system could turn against him. Erin Thompson sat in her office, her feet propped up on the edge of her desk. She had just finished another round of phone calls with Agent Harris, making sure everything was proceeding as planned. The tension in the air was palpable, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as she thought about how far she'd come. Judge Hayes had been a thorn in her side for far too long. His constant rulings against her clients, his refusal to follow the law. It was time for someone to hold him accountable. But now, with the investigation picking up speed, Erin was beginning to see the full picture of what this could become. She was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting for something much bigger. The phone rang again, cutting through her thoughts. She picked it up immediately, recognizing the number. "Thompson," she said, her voice all business. "Ms. Thompson," Harris's voice came through the line. "We've got some new information. The judge just met with Parker and Kane. He's clearly shaken, but he's still fighting back. He's trying to deny everything, claim that he's done nothing wrong." Erin's lips curled into a smile. Let him deny it. His every move is a sign of his guilt. The more he protests, the more it shows he knows he's in trouble. This is exactly what we want. Pressure him harder. Let him think he can get away with this. "We're pushing as hard as we can," Harris said, "but we need to be careful. The judge is already starting to prepare his defense. If he comes out swinging, this could escalate quickly." "Let him swing," Erin replied confidently. "The more he swings, the more exposed he'll become. We'll bury him with his own lies. He'll have nowhere to hide." Back in his chambers, Judge Hayes was trying to hold his ground, but the feeling of dread was inescapable. The meeting had done little to reassure him. Instead, it had confirmed his worst fear. Erin Thompson wasn't just playing a game. She was out to destroy him, to bring him down no matter what. Kane, who had been silently observing the meeting, spoke up once the agents had left. "Judge, I don't think you fully understand the severity of the situation. They have everything. The feds are already gathering witness testimony and court transcripts. If they push this any harder, you'll be left with no options." Hayes ran a hand over his face. "I didn't want to believe it, but it's true. They've got me cornered. And now, what do I do?" Kane sighed, clearly frustrated. "You need to stop thinking like a judge and start thinking like someone who's fighting for his life. This isn't about what's right anymore. It's about survival." Hayes clenched his fists. "I can't believe this is happening. I've been on the bench for over 2 decades. I've worked hard to get where I am. And now this woman, this prosecutor, is about to tear it all down." Kane gave him a pointed look. "You can either fold or you can fight. But if you fight, you need to be prepared for the consequences. You can't just half-step your way through this." The judge's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over one another. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of control. He was used to making the decisions, not having them made for him. But Erin Thompson had managed to flip the script. She had placed him in a position where every move he made now came with extreme consequences. Across town, Erin was taking the next step. She had set the investigation in motion, but she knew the real battle was still ahead. The clock was ticking, and Hayes wasn't going down without a fight. It was time to bring in the final pieces. She sat at her desk, drafting a statement for the press. This wasn't just about making the judge sweat. It was about making the public aware. If the media got involved, Hayes would have nowhere to hide. "I can't wait to see how he handles this," Erin muttered to herself, typing the final line of the statement, "because I'm about to expose everything." With one final click, the press release was sent out. Erin leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Let the game begin. Judge Hayes didn't sleep that night. The weight of the conversation with Parker and Kane had left him restless, haunted by the crushing reality that the system he had spent years upholding was now turning against him. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, his strict adherence to the law. But now those same laws were threatening to tear him apart. As dawn broke, Hayes stood in front of the mirror in his bathroom, staring at his reflection. The man who looked back at him seemed like a stranger, older, more worn, the weight of impending defeat written across his face. His thoughts raced, but there was no clear way out of the trap Aaron Thompson had set for him. He grabbed his phone, staring at the screen as if it held the answer. The most recent press release was still fresh in his mind. He'd seen the headlines already. They had gone public. Aaron Thompson had played her cards, and now everyone knew about the investigation into his conduct. The media was buzzing, talking about a judge under fire and serious misconduct allegations. It was no longer just a courtroom issue. It was a public spectacle, and once the media got their claws into a story like this, it would be nearly impossible to escape. Hayes took a deep breath, put down the phone, and made his way into his office. He needed to meet with Kane. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. If Aaron was going to bring the full force of the media and the FBI down on him, they needed a strategy. He couldn't wait for her to control the narrative. At Aaron's office, the mood was much different. She sat with her team reviewing the coverage. The morning's papers were full of headlines about Judge Hayes, the once respected jurist now being investigated for corruption and misconduct. Aaron's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, reporters, and even a few clients congratulating her on how quickly she had taken control of the situation. "This is just the beginning," Aaron said, glancing at her assistant, who was flipping through the latest news articles. "We need to keep the pressure on. The more public attention we get, the harder it will be for him to fight back." Her phone buzzed again. A message from Special Agent Harris flashed across the screen. "The judge has lawyered up. Kane's involved. He's trying to fight back." Aaron's lips curled into a smile. Let him fight. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. Kane's just another obstacle to crush. Her assistant, a young woman named Natalie, raised an eyebrow. "You're really going to go all the way with this, aren't you?" "Of course," Aaron replied without hesitation. "Hayes needs to be held accountable. This is about more than just him. It's about sending a message to everyone who thinks they can break the law without consequence. Corruption runs deep in the system, and I'm not going to let him slip away just because he's a judge." Natalie nodded, her respect for Aaron's resolve growing. Aaron was methodical, focused, and relentless. There was no room for doubt in her actions, no second-guessing. She was a force of nature, and no one, not even someone like Hayes, could stand in her way for long. Across town, Judge Hayes sat in a small, windowless conference room with Robert Kane. The defense attorney had brought in a few additional legal experts to help with the strategy, but the sense of impending doom was unavoidable. Kane, who had been cool and collected up until now, was finally showing signs of tension. "We need to play this carefully, Judge," Kane said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Aaron Thompson has gone public with the investigation, and the media is already starting to circle. We don't want to get dragged into a media war, but we can't just sit back and wait for the FBI to make its move." Hayes leaned forward, hands gripping the table. "What do you suggest? Should I just go on television and tell the world I'm innocent? Try to clear my name?" Kane shook his head. No. That would only make things worse. The last thing you want is to become a public spectacle. Once you go public, you can't take it back. But you do need to make a strong move and fast. We need to force the feds to go on the defensive." "And how do we do that?" Hayes asked, his voice laced with frustration. Kane's eyes narrowed. "We go on the offensive. We find out what Aaron Thompson has. We dig into her strategy, into her connections, and see if we can uncover something that makes her vulnerable. If we can shake her confidence, the feds will have to back off. You've got to show them that you're not going to be an easy target." Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know if I can do this. I've always tried to do the right thing. I've made rulings based on the law, not on politics. But now, I'm in the middle of a storm, and it's not stopping." "You don't have a choice anymore," Kane replied bluntly. "You either fight back, or you lose everything." Meanwhile, Aaron sat in a coffee shop, reviewing a new batch of evidence. The case was building piece by piece, and she could already feel the walls closing in on Hayes. Every day, more details about his past decisions came to light. Decisions that were starting to look more and more suspicious. And now that the media was involved, Hayes' reputation was crumbling faster than she expected. As Erin scanned the documents, a new notification popped up on her phone. It was an email from Agent Harris. "We've intercepted communications. Hayes is planning a counterattack. He's going to try to fight back using Kane's connections. They're digging into your past." Erin's eyes narrowed. "Let them dig," she muttered to herself. "I've got nothing to hide." She had anticipated that Hayes would make a desperate attempt to fight back. But Erin wasn't about to let him win. If he thought he could outsmart the FBI or intimidate her with legal tactics, he was mistaken. She had the law on her side. She had the facts. And now, with the public behind her, there was nothing Hayes could do to escape his fate. By the afternoon, the situation had taken a new turn. The judge's lawyers had filed a motion in court challenging the legitimacy of the investigation. They claimed that the feds were overstepping their bounds, that the entire process was a violation of Hayes' constitutional rights. The motion was, in essence, an attempt to delay the investigation and gain time to mount a defense. Erin sat in her office, watching the news as the announcement of the motion played on the television. Her phone rang. It was Agent Harris. "Erin," Harris said, his voice clipped. "We just got word. Hayes is trying to stall the investigation. He's challenging the entire process. We need to prepare for a legal battle." Erin's eyes flashed with determination. Let him challenge it. The more he stalls, the more it shows he's guilty. This is his last attempt to save face before everything unravels. "We're ready to move forward," Harris said, "but we'll need your support in court. If we go up against him, we need to make sure the feds don't back down." "I'll be there," Erin said firmly, her mind already racing with strategies, "and I won't let him get away with it." The battle lines had been drawn. Judge Hayes, backed into a corner, had begun his counterattack. But Erin was just getting started. With every move Hayes made, Erin would be right there, ready to strike back. The fight for justice had only just begun. But Erin knew one thing for sure: there would be no mercy. And Judge Hayes would learn the hard way that justice, when pursued relentlessly, never loses. Judge Hayes couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this much pressure. The days seemed to bleed together, each one dragging on longer than the last. After his legal team filed their motion to dismiss the investigation, he had hoped for a break, a moment of reprieve. Instead, he found himself staring at his phone every few minutes, waiting for an update, praying that the storm would pass. But it didn't. By noon, Erin Thompson's response had come in the form of a public statement, and it hit the headlines like a bombshell. She wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed more determined than ever. The statement accused Judge Hayes of attempting to delay justice, labeling his legal team's motion as nothing more than a desperate attempt to hide the truth. Erin had made it clear that the FBI would not be intimidated, and that the investigation would move forward, no matter what. Hayes clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had known Erin would push back hard. She had never been one to shy away from a fight. But this public escalation was a new level of intensity. The press was running with the story, and every new headline seemed to dig the knife in deeper. "Corrupt judge's last-ditch effort to stave off justice," read one. "Feds expose judge's dark secrets in ongoing investigation," read another. His phone buzzed again. It was another update from Robert Kane. "We need to meet. Urgent." Hayes gritted his teeth. There was no time to waste. He texted back a quick reply, "I'll be there in an hour." Erin had just finished reviewing the latest batch of evidence when her phone rang. It was Agent Harris. "Thompson," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got a problem. Hayes' legal team is pushing for a court hearing tomorrow. They're hoping to get an injunction to block our investigation. If the judge signs off on it, we could be stuck in legal limbo for weeks." Erin sat up straight. "Is there any way to stop it?" "We're working on it, but we need you in court." The judge will likely want to hear from you. He's going to want to know why we're moving so fast. If we can't convince him, we might lose our momentum." "Understood," Erin said, her mind already racing through strategies. "I'll be there. We're not giving them a single inch." She hung up and immediately began making arrangements. If Hayes thought he could stall this investigation by throwing legal hurdles in their way, he was about to learn just how relentless she could be. She had already been down this road before. The stakes had never been higher, but she wasn't about to back down. When Hayes arrived at his lawyer's office, Kane was already waiting for him. The room was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kane didn't waste time on pleasantries. As soon as Hayes sat down, he spoke. "We're in a tight spot. The court hearing is set for tomorrow morning. The feds are coming after us hard, and Thompson's not going to let up. We need to prepare a solid argument, but I'm starting to think we need to go in a different direction." Hayes' brow furrowed. "What do you mean, different direction?" Kane hesitated for a moment, glancing at the documents spread across the table before meeting Hayes' eyes. "I think we need to fight fire with fire. We need to expose some of Thompson's tactics. If we can make her look like the aggressor, someone willing to break the rules to get what she wants, it might take some of the heat off you." The idea hit Hayes like a jolt. He hadn't considered going after Erin directly, but it was an interesting thought. She had the public on her side right now, and that was a dangerous weapon. If they could find a way to turn the tide, to make her look like the villain, maybe they could shift the narrative. "Do you think we can pull it off?" Hayes asked, his voice uncertain but with a flicker of hope. "I don't know, but it's our best shot. The feds will be in full force tomorrow, but we'll need to expose any inconsistencies in their case. If we can find anything at all, that makes her look like she's manipulating the system to destroy you, we might stand a chance." Hayes sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling in. He had always believed in the law, but now he was beginning to see it as a battlefield. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. It was no longer just about his reputation. It was about survival. The following morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras flashing as Judge Hayes entered, flanked by his legal team. The tension in the air was palpable. Erin was already sitting at the prosecution table, her face set in a determined expression. She was ready for this fight, and she knew it would be a battle for the ages. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze, called the court to order. He looked at Hayes and Erin, his eyes flicking back and forth as he took in the magnitude of the situation. "Let's begin," the judge said, his voice gruff but composed. "We're here today to determine whether the investigation into Judge Hayes' conduct should proceed. Ms. Thompson, you may begin." Erin stood up, walking confidently to the front of the courtroom. Her voice rang clear and strong as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, and the facts are simple. Judge Hayes has been the subject of a thorough investigation by the FBI, and the evidence against him is undeniable. We have discovered a pattern of biased rulings, unethical behavior, and illegal influence. The actions of this man have undermined the integrity of the judicial system, and we are simply asking for the investigation to continue so that we can get to the truth." She paused, her eyes locking onto Hayes's, then continued, her tone unwavering. "If Judge Hayes truly believes he is innocent, then he should have nothing to fear from this investigation. But instead, he is attempting to block it at every turn. Why is that, Your Honor? Why is he so afraid of the truth?" The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting for the judge's response. Hayes' legal team rose to their feet. Robert Kane, looking calm but sharp, addressed the court. "Your Honor, we ask for a dismissal of this case. The motion filed by the prosecution is based on circumstantial evidence, not fact. There is no solid proof of any wrongdoing. What we have here is a politically motivated attack on a respected member of the judiciary. And frankly, if we allow this investigation to continue, it will set a dangerous precedent for all judges in this country." He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, "If Ms. Thompson and her team had real evidence, they would have presented it by now. This investigation is nothing more than an effort to destroy Judge Hayes' career." We ask for your protection against this unjust pursuit." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Thompson?" Erin stood tall, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We have more than enough evidence, Your Honor. In fact, we are prepared to present even more today. If Judge Hayes believes this is some sort of political witch hunt, he's sorely mistaken. This is about justice. This is about the truth coming to light. And nothing will stop us from uncovering it." Hayes's heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and he could sense the growing pressure. Erin was playing this game like a pro. She was the one in control, and it made him furious. But there was no turning back now. His legal team had done their best, but it was clear that Erin wasn't going to back down. The judge was now left with a choice. He could either dismiss the case, or he could let the investigation proceed. The decision was in his hands. And as the minutes ticked by, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what happened, it was all slipping out of his control. The judge took a deep breath, his gavel poised in his hand. "I will make my ruling shortly," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone was waiting for the moment that could change everything. But as the judge prepared to speak, an unexpected interruption came from the back of the room. A man in a suit stood up, a man Hayes didn't recognize, and spoke with a voice that carried across the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have something you need to see." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. All eyes turned toward the man who had just spoken, standing in the back. He wasn't one of the regular attorneys. He wasn't even a law enforcement official. Hayes's heart skipped a beat. Who was this guy? The man's presence was commanding. Tall, with a neat dark suit and glasses, he looked calm but resolute, his hand gripping a folder of documents. His eyes swept across the room, locking briefly with Erin's before he turned to the judge. "I'm Special Agent Ben Archer," the man said, his voice steady. "And I have new evidence, critical evidence, that I believe could significantly alter the direction of this case." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, a slight look of surprise crossing his face. "What kind of evidence, Agent Archer?" Archer moved forward, holding up the folder. "Your Honor, this evidence shows that the investigation into Judge Hayes is not what it appears to be. In fact, there are serious questions about the integrity of this entire case. We have reason to believe that someone may be manipulating the facts, and this case might be built on false pretenses." The tension in the room was palpable. Hayes's stomach twisted as he tried to read the room. What was happening? Was this some kind of tactic from Erin's team? Or was it something more? Erin stood up sharply, her voice cutting through the air. "Objection, Your Honor. We've been through this. The evidence against Judge Hayes is rock solid. This is just another attempt to derail the investigation." Judge Harrison held up his hand, silencing Erin. "Miss Thompson, let the agent speak." Erin bit her lip in frustration, but she sat down, glaring at Agent Archer. Archer opened the folder slowly and placed several documents on the table in front of the judge. "We've intercepted communications between someone within the FBI and a key witness in this case. Communications that suggest there may have been an effort to manipulate the investigation in a way that could implicate Judge Hayes unfairly. This includes emails, phone records, and text messages that point to a possible leak of information to someone with a vested interest in framing the judge." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Hayes could feel his heart racing, his mind trying to process what was being said. A leak? How was that possible? Who would have done that? "Who is behind this, Agent Archer?" the judge asked, now looking more intrigued than suspicious. Agent Archer's expression remained neutral. "We're still investigating, but I can tell you that we are working to identify the individual or individuals who may have tampered with the investigation. For now, I recommend we pause these proceedings until we can determine the full extent of this breach." Erin stood up again, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We've already presented ample evidence. This is just a delay tactic." Judge Harrison raised his hand again, this time more firmly. "Ms. Thompson, I'm not ignoring your case, But I have to take Agent Archer's new information into account. This is serious. If what he's saying is true, it could change everything. We will reconvene tomorrow and I expect a full briefing on this new evidence. Erin's face was flushed with anger, but there was nothing more she could do. She sat back down, seething. Judge Hayes felt his hands tremble. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to exhale. The moment was fleeting, though. There was still too much uncertainty, too much danger hanging over him. Agent Archer's words echoed in his mind. Someone within the FBI was trying to frame him. That didn't make sense. Who could be behind it? And why? The rest of the session was a blur as the judge called for a recess. Hayes stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room shift. The air had thickened. Everyone had questions, but only one thing was certain. The ground beneath him was shifting, and he wasn't sure if it was a trap or a lifeline. Later that evening, Hayes found himself back at his office, pacing in front of his desk. His thoughts were scattered. The bombshell Agent Archer had dropped had turned everything upside down. Was it possible that Erin Thompson, or someone close to her, had planted evidence to build a false case against him? He didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much was at stake for everyone involved. He picked up his phone and called Robert Kane. It rang twice before Kane answered. "Judge," Kane's voice came through. "I'm guessing you saw what happened in court today." "Yeah," Hayes replied, his voice strained. "But I don't know what to make of it. This new evidence, the FBI is saying there was a breach in the investigation. Someone's been leaking information. But who? And why?" Kane sighed. "It's a lot to process. But if there's any truth to what Archer said, it's a game changer. You're right to be concerned. Whoever did this could have planted false information to frame you. Or worse, they could be playing both sides, using you as a pawn in something bigger." Hayes paused, his mind racing. Could Erin have something to do with this? "I don't know," Kane said, his voice thoughtful. "But it's clear she's playing for keeps. She's been relentless, and now she's got the public on her side. If she's involved in this manipulation, she's playing a dangerous game. But we can't rule anything out." Hayes' hand tightened around the phone. "I need answers, Kane. I can't just sit here and wait to get blindsided. If someone's trying to take me down, I need to know who they are. I'll get to work on it. We'll dig into Archer's claims, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, we've got to be ready for the next move." Hayes nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. "Thanks, Robert. Keep me posted." After hanging up, Hayes slumped into his chair. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to make sense of the chaotic situation. He had fought for his career, his reputation, and his honor. But now it felt like everything was slipping away. And the worst part, he had no idea who was pulling the strings. The next day, the courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different. Erin sat at the prosecution table. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the room. She hadn't been expecting the surprise from Agent Archer, and the disruption to her carefully laid plans had rattled her. But she was not the type to lose focus. She knew that no matter what happened, the truth was on her side. The judge would see that. He had to. The judge called the proceedings to order. Judge Harrison's eyes were sharp as he addressed the room. "We are here to review the new evidence presented by Special Agent Archer. I've been briefed on the matter, and I've instructed both the prosecution and defense to prepare for further investigation. We will reconvene in 1 week, at which time we will consider the results of the ongoing inquiry." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. 1 week? The delay was unexpected, but Erin knew that this wasn't the end. It was simply a setback. As the session adjourned, she watched Hayes closely. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the strain in his face. He was nervous, and that, in her mind, was a sign of weakness. Erin gathered her things and stood up. Before she could leave the courtroom, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw Agent Harris standing behind her, his expression tight. "Erin, we need to talk. Something's come up." She raised an eyebrow, concerned. "What is it?" We've got a lead on who might be behind the leak, and it's not who you think." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Harris's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's someone close to Judge Hayes, someone in his inner circle." Erin's mind raced as Agent Harris's words settled into her thoughts. Someone close to Judge Hayes. Her stomach tightened with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. She had been so focused on Hayes himself, on his every move, that it had never occurred to her that the real threat might be hiding in plain sight, someone from within his own camp. "What do you mean close to him?" Erin asked, her voice low. Harris looked over at his shoulder to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "We've tracked down communications between one of Hayes's senior clerks and an unknown party. They were discussing the case in detail, details that weren't available to the public or even to most people working on the investigation. The clerk may have been feeding information to someone who has an interest in discrediting you." Erin's heart pounded. This was unexpected. Hayes had always been careful, but if someone in his inner circle was working against her, it could explain how certain pieces of information had ended up in the wrong hands. "Do we know who this clerk is?" Erin asked, her thoughts already starting to shift toward action. "We're working on it," Harris said, "but we need more time to fully trace the communications. Whoever it is, they're careful. But we've got leads." Erin nodded, her mind already turning over possibilities. If Hayes had a mole in his camp, this could be the key to everything. The whole investigation could hinge on what this clerk knew and who they were talking to. "We need to move fast on this," she said firmly. "Keep me posted. I want to know as soon as you have a name." "Of course," Harris replied before quickly leaving her side to return to his team. Erin stood in the hallway, her mind whirling. A mole in Hayes's camp wasn't just a small crack in the case. It was a bombshell that could explode everything wide open. But there was something unsettling about the whole thing. Hayes had always been so careful with his inner circle. How had they gotten this close to him? Back in his office, Hayes felt like he was suffocating. The walls of his private chambers were closing in on him. His mind churned with thoughts of Agent Archer's surprise revelation. A breach in the FBI's investigation. Someone inside the system working against him. It didn't make sense. He trusted his team. His clerks had been loyal. Some of them had been with him for years. Yet the more he thought about it, the more something felt off. Who could it be? The mole in his camp, who had they been talking to? And why? The thought of betrayal sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to him had set him up, had been feeding information to Erin's team to ruin him. But who? His office door creaked open, and Robert Kane walked in, holding a manila folder in his hand. "Got some updates, Judge. Thought you'd want to see these." Hayes didn't look up from his desk. He had been trying to stay focused, to block out the noise of his thoughts, but the pieces weren't fitting together. Kane placed the folder on the desk and sat across from him. "Hayes, we've got a real mess on our hands," Kane said, his tone more serious than usual. "You know that FBI agent, Archer, right? He's playing us like a fiddle. I've seen his type before. He's got an agenda. The question is, whose side is he really on?" Hayes frowned, still staring at the folder. "I don't know, Robert. Something's not right here. This whole thing feels like a setup." Kane leaned forward. "You think someone's framing you?" Hayes paused, then nodded slowly. "I don't know how or why, but I feel like something's off, and I think the answer's in the people around me." Kane raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, I just feel like I'm being played. This isn't just about Erin Thompson. There's someone behind the curtain, someone who's feeding her information, someone who's manipulating the whole situation." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying one of your own people is working with her? A mole?" Hayes clenched his fists. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And if we don't find out who it is soon, it's over." Kane sat back in his chair, folding his arms. "This is bigger than I thought. If someone's really working with Thompson, it could ruin everything. But we don't have any hard evidence yet, so we need to tread carefully." "I know," Hayes said, his voice tight. But we need to find this person before they destroy me. I don't care who it is. I need answers. Later that night, Hayes lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The investigation had taken on a life of its own. His reputation, his career, everything was hanging in the balance. The question that gnawed at him, though, was the same one that had been haunting him for days. Who could be betraying him? His thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. He reached for it, his heart skipping when he saw the name on the screen. It was Agent Harris. Judge Hayes. Harris's voice crackled on the other end. We've got something. What is it? Hayes asked, sitting up in bed, his mind already jumping to conclusions. It's the clerk. Harris said, his voice low. We've identified who it is, and you won't believe who it is. Hayes felt his pulse quicken. Who? There was a pause, a long one, as if Harris was trying to figure out how to break the news. Your head clerk, Terrence Wilson, Harris said. He's the one who's been leaking information. The words hit Hayes like a ton of bricks. He could hardly believe it. Terrence? Wilson had been with him for years. He was loyal, efficient, and above all, someone Hayes had trusted completely. But now Harris was telling him that Wilson had been feeding information to Aaron Thompson's team, helping to build a case against him. No, Hayes whispered, his mind racing. No, that can't be right. I wish it weren't, Harris said. But the evidence is clear. Wilson's communications with Aaron Thompson's team were frequent, and they go back months. He's been a key player in this whole operation. Hayes could hardly breathe. Terrence Wilson, the one person he had never suspected, was the mole. The betrayal was unimaginable. What do we do now? Hayes asked, his voice strained. We need to move quickly, Harris said. We're already tracking his movements. I recommend you confront him immediately. If he's really been working against you, we need to contain the situation before it escalates. Hayes's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. He had been so sure of his team, so confident in his inner circle. But now everything he had built felt like it was crumbling. I'll deal with it, Hayes said, his voice cold, though his mind was spinning with disbelief. Thank you, Agent Harris. Keep me updated. As he hung up, Hayes sat in the darkness, struggling to process the weight of what he had just learned. Terrence Wilson. He had trusted him. He had relied on him. And now he was the one who had been working against him all along. With a deep breath, Hayes stood up. He couldn't afford to wait. He had to confront Wilson, and he had to do it now. The next morning, Hayes stormed into his office, his mind clouded with anger and betrayal. Terrence Wilson was sitting at his desk, flipping through some files as if nothing had happened, as if nothing had changed. The sight of him, the same calm, collected clerk who had always seemed so trustworthy, made Hayes' blood boil. Wilson, Hayes said, his voice low and sharp. Wilson looked up, his face turning pale when he saw Hayes standing in the doorway, his eyes burning with fury. Judge, what's going on? Wilson asked, his voice shaking slightly. Don't play dumb with me, Hayes snapped, walking into the room. I know everything. I know you've been leaking information to Aaron Thompson. You've been working with her to bring me down. Wilson's face went white. His mouth opened and closed as if he was searching for words, but none came. You've betrayed me, Terrence, Hayes said coldly, stepping closer. I trusted you. And now I'm going to make sure you pay for this. Wilson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Hayes spoke again. Get out. You're fired. And I'll make sure you never work in this town again. Wilson stood frozen, his hands trembling. He tried to speak, but Hayes didn't want to hear it. He had already made up his mind. I said get out, Hayes repeated, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Wilson turned, stumbling toward the door. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Hayes didn't even watch him leave. He knew what he had to do now. He had to clean up the mess Wilson had left behind. He had to bury the truth before it buried him. But as he sat down at his desk, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. The next few days passed in a blur. Hayes barely slept, consumed by a mix of anger and disbelief. Terrence Wilson, the man he had trusted most in his inner circle, was now a traitor, and Hayes could not shake the feeling that the worst was far from over. He had fired Wilson on the spot, but that didn't erase the damage already done. The leaks to Aaron Thompson's team were a clear violation of trust, but what really shook Hayes to the core was the idea that Wilson had been playing him all along. Who else had Wilson been talking to? Had he been the only one? The consequences of Wilson's betrayal were far-reaching. Hayes had been in the public eye for years, and with every new revelation about his case, the pressure was mounting. Aaron Thompson, now with this fresh lead, was more determined than ever to take him down. If he didn't act fast, his career could be destroyed before he had a chance to prove his innocence. Aaron Thompson was having a moment of triumph. The leak, the evidence that Judge Hayes had a mole in his camp. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The case was moving in her favor, and with Wilson's betrayal now exposed, she felt more certain than ever that Hayes was guilty. But there was a part of her, a small nagging part, that wondered about the motives behind Wilson's actions. Who was he working for? And what was the bigger plan? Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that they were all part of a much larger game. She sat in her office late one evening, the lights dim and the air thick with tension. Her phone buzzed, and she quickly grabbed it, her fingers trembling slightly. It was Agent Harris. "Aaron." Harris's voice came through the phone, low and serious. "We've got something. We've been tracking Wilson's communications, and there's more to this than we first thought. He wasn't just leaking information to your team. He was working with someone else." Aaron's pulse quickened. "Who?" Harris hesitated. "We think he's been in contact with a high-ranking official, someone who's been pulling the strings. We're still tracing the full extent of it, but it's clear now. Wilson was a small player in a much larger operation." Aaron sat up straight. "Who's behind it all?" "We're not sure yet, but I think it's time we consider the possibility that Judge Hayes wasn't the real target here." Aaron felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the people working against you, working against Hayes, they might have been using him as a pawn in a much bigger scheme." Aaron's mind raced. A pawn? Hayes wasn't just a target. He was a part of something larger. "I'll need everything you've got on this," Aaron said, her voice firm. "If someone's playing both sides, I want to know who it is and why." Meanwhile, Hayes was deep in his own investigation. He couldn't trust anyone, not now, not after Wilson's betrayal. Every person in his office, every staff member, every acquaintance was now a potential threat. The paranoia was consuming him, but he had no choice but to keep moving forward. Kane had advised him to stay low for a while, to let the heat die down, but Hayes couldn't. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The more he thought about the situation, the more he realized that there were too many loose ends. If Wilson had been leaking information to Aaron's team, who else could have been involved? Could someone else from the FBI, or worse, from his own team, have been working with Aaron all along? Hayes needed to find out who, and he needed to do it fast. His office door swung open, and Robert Kane stepped inside, his face grim. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Kane said, settling into the chair across from Hayes. "I haven't," Hayes replied flatly. "I can't afford to. There's something bigger going on here, Kane. I can feel it. I need to know who else is involved." Kane nodded. "I agree. But right now, we've got to play this carefully. If we move too quickly, we'll just make things worse. We've got to find out who Wilson was talking to and what he was really doing. We need more than just a confession." "I don't need his confession," Hayes snapped. "I need names. I need to know who's been pulling the strings." Kane leaned back, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair. "I'm working on it. But right now, I think your best bet is to stay quiet. Let things settle for a while. The last thing we need is for Thompson to get any more ammunition. If she finds out we're onto something, she'll use it against us." Hayes clenched his jaw. "I'm not waiting. I'm done hiding. If I don't make a move now, I won't have a career left to save. Kane sighed. I understand, but we need a plan. You need to be strategic. That evening, as Hayes left his office, he was met with an unexpected visitor. His phone rang just as he stepped into the elevator. Judge Hayes, a voice on the other end said, I have something for you. It was a woman's voice, smooth but laced with a strange edge. Hayes frowned, not recognizing it immediately. Who is this? He demanded. It's not important who I am, the voice replied. But what I have to say is, if you want to stay in control of this case, you need to know what's really happening behind the scenes. You're not the only one being played here. Hayes's instincts flared. What are you talking about? I can help you, the woman said, her voice almost a whisper. But you need to listen carefully. There's a much bigger game at play here, one that goes beyond you, beyond Aaron Thompson. If you want to make it out alive, professionally at least, you have to be ready for the truth. The line went dead. Hayes stood frozen, his heart pounding. Who was that? What did she know? And how could she help him? The following day, Hayes met with Kane in his office. They sat together, poring over the details of the case once again. The phone call the night before had shaken Hayes more than he cared to admit. She said she could help me, Hayes muttered, running his hands through his hair. But she didn't say who she was. She didn't give me anything. Kane looked skeptical. Sounds like a trap to me. Maybe, Hayes replied, still uncertain. But something about it felt different. Like she knew something big. I think it's worth following up. Kane leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. We're already walking on a tightrope, Hayes. If we get caught up in someone else's scheme, it'll be the end of us. I don't have a choice, Hayes said, his voice firm. I need answers. The clock's ticking, and I'm not just going to wait around while someone else makes the next move. As the two men continued their discussion, neither of them realized just how close they were to unraveling something far darker than they had imagined. The threads of the conspiracy that had been weaving through the FBI, the courts, and even within Hayes's own staff were pulling tighter. And soon the truth would be exposed, whether they were ready for it or not. But the question remained, who was behind it all? And what would they do when the walls finally came crashing down? The chapter ended, but the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on everyone. The real game was just beginning. And Hayes had no idea who he could trust anymore. The following days felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Every minute that passed brought more pressure, more uncertainty. The deeper Hayes dug into the web of betrayal, the more tangled it became. The woman who had called him, the mysterious voice on the other end of the phone, was a ghost. No one had been able to trace her call, and despite his efforts to reach out again, she didn't answer. But Hayes couldn't afford to ignore her warning. It didn't matter if she was a trick or an ally. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, and he needed to figure out who. If he didn't, the entire case could spiral out of control. Aaron Thompson's investigation was nearing its peak. Every lead had been followed to its dead end, until they unearthed the one that changed everything. Wilson, the clerk Hayes had trusted, had not only been leaking information to her team, but had been in contact with an informant on the inside of Hayes's inner circle. His communications, now fully tracked, painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated attack. But what wasn't clear yet was who was orchestrating it, and why. Erin sat in her office, poring over the latest evidence. She had been working nonstop, and the exhaustion was starting to show. Dark circles under her eyes, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the files. She needed something concrete, something to tie everything together. And she was close. She could feel it. Agent Harris walked in, holding a file in his hand. He had a serious look on his face. "Erin," he said, "we found something that might change everything." Erin looked up, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "We've managed to trace some of Wilson's communications further back. He wasn't just in touch with Thompson's team. He was talking to someone else, someone bigger, someone in a position of power." Erin's brow furrowed. "Who?" Harris hesitated. He had the file open but wasn't showing it to her yet. "You won't believe this," he said, his voice steady but full of tension. "I don't have time for games, Harris," Erin replied, her voice sharp. "Show me." Harris dropped the file on her desk and stepped back. Erin grabbed it and skimmed through the pages, her eyes scanning the details. "Judge Hayes," Erin whispered under her breath. The file showed a pattern. A detailed record of Wilson's communications with none other than Hayes himself. But it wasn't just a simple exchange of information. Hayes had been directly involved in some of Wilson's dealings with Erin's team. His personal involvement was undeniable. "That doesn't make sense," Erin murmured. "Why would Hayes be involved in his own downfall? Why would he be helping Wilson leak information about his own case?" She looked up at Harris, her mind racing. What does this mean? Are we saying that Hayes was working with Wilson the whole time? "Not necessarily," Harris said, his tone grave. "But it's clear that Hayes knew what Wilson was doing. He was complicit in some way. What we don't know yet is whether he was doing it willingly or if someone was forcing his hand." Erin leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, but there were still gaps. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something they weren't seeing yet. Hayes's mind had become a battleground. He had received no more calls from the mysterious woman, and now he was beginning to wonder if she had ever really been an ally, or if she was part of the problem. His every move was being watched. The pressure was mounting, and he felt the weight of every decision crushing down on him. He paced his office late into the night, hands rubbing his temples, trying to focus. His thoughts were tangled. There was no way Wilson had acted alone. The clerk had been too loyal, too deeply involved in the workings of the court system. If he'd been playing both sides, who else was involved? Who else had a motive to bring him down? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Robert Kane stepped inside, looking serious as usual, but with a subtle edge of concern in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Hayes asked, already sensing the shift in the air. "We need to talk," Kane said quietly. "It's about the case." Hayes sat up straight, his heart starting to race. "What now?" "I've been hearing rumors," Kane continued. "People are talking. Something's going on with Thompson's investigation. She's closer than we thought. There are whispers about some sort of deal between your office and the FBI. But it's not just them anymore. There's someone else pulling the strings, someone even higher up than the FBI." Hayes felt a jolt of panic shoot through him. "Who?" "I don't know," Kane said, his voice low. "But I think it's someone who has a vested interest in you losing this case. Someone who stands to gain a lot if you're out of the picture." Hayes's mind raced. A higher power? He had assumed the FBI was the biggest threat. But this was a new layer. A new complication he hadn't anticipated. "We need to find out who this is," Hayes said firmly. "I can't afford to have anyone else pulling the strings behind the scenes." That night, as Hayes lay in bed, a familiar feeling of dread crept over him. He had been so focused on the immediate threats, the mole in his camp, the leaks to Erin Thompson, that he had neglected the possibility of something far more dangerous. An unseen force working against him from the top down. He had spent his career navigating through the power structures of the court system. But this felt different. The people who were playing him, playing his team, they were far more calculated, far more dangerous than anyone he had ever faced. Then, in the dead of night, his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a strange woman's voice. It was the voice he had been dreading. Agent Harris. "Judge Hayes," Harris said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have a problem. We've traced the communications all the way back, and we've identified the source. You're not going to believe it." Hayes sat up in bed, his heart pounding. "Who?" "It's not Wilson," Harris said. "It's someone much higher up, someone who has been working behind the scenes, orchestrating the entire investigation. And the name we found? Well, it's a name you're going to recognize." Hayes's mind raced. "Who?" Harris paused, then said the name that sent a shockwave through Hayes's entire body. "It's Robert Kane." The world went silent for a moment. Hayes couldn't speak. His mind was spinning, the room closing in around him. Kane, his most trusted advisor, the one person he had relied on to help him navigate the treacherous waters of his career, was the one behind everything. How? Hayes managed to whisper. How do you know? We've been tracking his communications, Harris said, his voice grim. And the evidence is overwhelming. He's been working with Wilson and feeding information to Thompson. He's the one who's been pulling the strings all along. Hayes's chest tightened, and he felt the cold grip of betrayal seizing him. His own right hand, the man he thought he could trust more than anyone else, had been playing him from the very beginning. Are you sure? Hayes's voice trembled. We're sure, Harris replied. We have the proof. The room felt like it was closing in on Hayes. He had trusted Kane with everything, his career, his secrets, his plans. But Kane had been the one orchestrating his downfall. I'll handle it, Hayes said, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. The line went dead. Hayes sat there, staring at the phone in his hand. The betrayal was too much to process. His world was crumbling. And the worst part, it was only just beginning. The betrayal hit Hayes like a tidal wave. The very foundation of this life, the one person he had trusted more than anyone else, had turned out to be the mastermind behind his ruin. Robert Kane, his closest ally, had been the one feeding information to Aaron Thompson, working with Terrence Wilson, and manipulating the investigation from the shadows. Hayes's heart pounded in his chest as the truth settled over him like a heavy, suffocating weight. But what did Kane want? Why would someone he had considered a friend go to such extreme lengths to bring him down? Hayes didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. The game had changed, and now he was the target. The next morning, Hayes's mind was in chaos. His usual composure had completely shattered, and he struggled to make sense of it all. Kane had been a constant presence in his life. The man who had guided him through difficult times, the man who had kept him grounded, was now the one orchestrating his fall from grace. Hayes's trust in people, in the entire system, had been utterly destroyed. The weight of it threatened to overwhelm him. But Hayes wasn't going to give up. Not yet. He had spent his entire life working for this moment, to be a judge, to be respected, to make a difference in the system. And no one, not even Kane, was going to take that away from him without a fight. At the same time, Aaron Thompson's investigation was reaching a fever pitch. With the new evidence she had uncovered about Kane's involvement, everything was starting to fall into place. She had suspected for weeks that there was more to the story than just Wilson's leaks. Now she had confirmation that Kane, the very man who had been working with Hayes for years, had been secretly feeding her team critical information. Aaron felt a sense of vindication, but also a creeping unease. The deeper they dug, the darker the web became. Kane was a powerful figure, and if he had been behind everything, that meant the conspiracy was far more widespread than they had initially thought. Sitting in her office, Aaron looked at the file Harris had brought her. Kane's name kept appearing in the communications logs, time and time again. And it wasn't just casual contacts. Kane had been in direct communication with high-ranking officials within the FBI, offering them information about Hayes and his potential involvement in illegal activities. The whole operation was meticulously planned, and Aaron realized she had only scratched the surface. Agent Harris, Aaron said, looking up from the file, we need to go after Kane. If he's been the one pulling all the strings, then he's the key to everything. We need to take him down. Harris nodded, his face serious. But going after Kane means we're going after a much bigger network. If he's involved in this, there's a chance that others are too. We don't know how deep this goes. Aaron clenched her fists. I don't care how deep it goes. We have to stop this now, before Hayes gets away with whatever he's done. Hayes spent the entire day in his office, turning over every piece of evidence in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. He kept thinking about Kane's motivations. What had driven him to betray him so completely? Was it money? Power? Revenge? His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the caller ID. It was Robert Kane. Hayes. Kane's voice came through, calm and measured, as if nothing had changed. We need to talk." Hayes' stomach tightened. The audacity of Kane to call him after everything he had done, after everything Hayes had just learned, was almost too much to bear. But Hayes knew he had no choice but to speak with him. He had to confront him. He had to get answers. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Kane," Hayes said coldly, his voice tight with anger. "Don't be so quick to make up your mind," Kane replied, his tone still smooth, but with a hint of something else, something darker. "I know you've learned a lot, but there are things you don't understand. Things you need to hear from me." Hayes gritted his teeth, trying to keep his composure. "I don't need to hear anything from you. You've been betraying me, feeding information to Aaron Thompson, working with Wilson behind my back. You've been playing both sides this whole time, and now it's over." Kane laughed softly, a cold, hollow sound. "You think it's over, Hayes? You think you've got it all figured out? You have no idea what's really going on here." "I don't care about your excuses," Hayes spat. "I trusted you. You've been my closest ally, and you've destroyed everything." Kane was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're making a mistake. What you don't understand is that this isn't just about you. This is bigger than you, bigger than Thompson, bigger than anyone else involved. This is about power, control. And if you don't play your part, you're going to lose everything you already have." Hayes' blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough," Kane said, his voice almost a whisper. "But if you want to have any chance of saving yourself, you need to stop this investigation now. Don't dig any deeper. Walk away. I'm giving you a way out." The line went dead. Hayes stood there, staring at the phone in his hand. The threat was clear. Kane was warning him. But why? What was Kane planning? And what would happen if Hayes refused to back down? That evening, Hayes was torn between two impossible choices. He could walk away, do as Kane said, and try to save whatever was left of his career. Or he could continue the investigation, risk everything, and expose the truth. But the truth wasn't simple anymore. Kane's cryptic warning had planted a seed of doubt in Hayes' mind. What if Kane was right? What if he was being played by someone else, someone even more dangerous? What if exposing Kane would only make things worse? Hayes knew he couldn't live with himself if he backed down. But as the hours passed and the weight of the decision pressed on him, he began to feel the walls closing in. The people who were after him were ruthless. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the truth might be the one thing that could save him or destroy him. He picked up the phone and dialed Robert Kane's number, his hands shaking. The phone rang 3 times before Kane answered. "I'm not walking away," Hayes said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm going to finish this, and I'm going to find out who's really behind everything." Kane's voice was calm, but edged with something dangerous. "You've made your choice, Hayes, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Hayes hung up the phone, a sudden sense of finality settled over him. The investigation was no longer just about his career. It was about something far deeper, something he hadn't fully understood until now. There were bigger forces at play. Forces that would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. And Hayes was about to discover just how far those forces were willing to go. But as he stared out the window of his office, the weight of his decision settled in. The storm had only just begun, and the next move would decide everything. The next day, Hayes stood before the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie as the reality of his situation loomed over him. The weight of his decision, the decision to fight back, to refuse Kane's ultimatum, felt heavier now than ever before. He could sense that this was the point of no return. Whatever was about to come, he was no longer just a passive player. Hayes was a marked man. The consequences of his choice were clear. If he followed through with the investigation, there was a good chance it would ruin him. He could lose everything, his career, his reputation, his freedom. But if he backed down, he would lose himself. Hayes had spent his whole life working to build something meaningful, something he could be proud of. Walking away now, after everything he'd fought for, wasn't an option. Aaron Thompson, on the other hand, was deep in her own battle. The revelations about Robert Kane had hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been so focused on Hayes, so convinced that he was the puppet master behind everything, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. Kane's involvement in the case changed everything. If he was behind all of this, then Hayes' innocence, or guilt, wasn't the primary issue anymore. The real question was, why had Kane done all of this, and who else was involved? She couldn't shake the feeling that Kane's betrayal of Hayes was just one part of a much larger scheme. She had already uncovered a network of corruption within the system, but now, the deeper they dug, the more questions were raised. Was Kane part of a broader conspiracy? Was there more at stake than just Hayes' career? Erin sat at her desk, the silence of the office almost suffocating. She stared at the pile of files in front of her, her mind racing. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. The walls were closing in on Hayes, and the clock was ticking. But the more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. If Kane had been playing both sides all along, it was possible that Hayes had been telling the truth all this time. And what if Kane was using Erin too? What if the case wasn't about justice at all, but about something far darker, something that could change everything she had ever known about the system she had worked so hard to protect? Hayes knew that if he was going to expose Kane, he needed something concrete, something that would prove Kane's treachery beyond a shadow of a doubt. But every lead he chased down seemed to bring him closer to a dead end. Kane was too clever, too careful, and the people in Hayes' circle were either too scared or too loyal to betray him. As the day wore on, Hayes found himself getting more frustrated. He had hit a wall. Then, as he was about to leave his office for the night, he received an unexpected visitor. The door to his office opened slowly, and in walked a man he had not seen in years. It was Vincent Harris, a former colleague who had once worked with Hayes on a major case before he had abruptly disappeared from the public eye. Vincent had always been a little eccentric, a bit of a lone wolf, but Hayes had respected him. Now, standing in the doorway, Harris looked almost unrecognizable, his face haggard, eyes wide with panic. "Hayes," Vincent said in a low, urgent voice, "you're in danger." Hayes stood up slowly, his hand resting on the edge of his desk. "What are you talking about?" Vincent's eyes darted around the room, as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "I don't have much time. You have to trust me. Kane is involved in something far bigger than you realize. And it's not just about you and Erin. The people who are pulling the strings are powerful, too powerful for anyone to go after them without consequences." Hayes felt his pulse quicken. "What are you saying? Who's behind all this?" Vincent stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been following the wrong leads. Kane was never the endgame. He's just the tip of the iceberg. The real people pulling the strings are far more dangerous, and they're not just in the system. They're outside of it, running things behind the scenes. Kane got too close, and now he's trying to protect himself." Vincent looked over his shoulder once more before continuing. "I've been working on something, a case that goes deeper than anything you can imagine. It's tied to an underground network that's been manipulating court cases, investigations, everything. They have people in place in every level of government, every corner of law enforcement. This isn't just about a rogue judge or a corrupt official. This is about a larger conspiracy, one that goes back decades." Hayes' mind was spinning. How could this be possible? "You've seen the leaks, the connections, the manipulations," Vincent continued. "But what you don't know is that it goes beyond just you. Beyond just Hayes, beyond just Erin Thompson. They've been running things from the shadows for years. And Kane, well, Kane got too close. Now he's trying to cover his tracks, trying to protect himself. But he's too far gone. If you go after him, you're going to find out who's really behind everything." Vincent's words were heavy with warning. Hayes took a deep breath, his mind reeling. If what Vincent said was true, it would change everything he thought he knew about the case, and the people he had trusted. "I don't understand," Hayes said, shaking his head. "Who are they? And why are you telling me this now?" Vincent stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Because they know you're coming for them. They know you won't back down, and they're already preparing for what happens next. As Hayes processed the gravity of Vincent's words, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He had been so focused on the investigation, so consumed by the idea of exposing Kane, that he hadn't realized the true scale of what he was up against. The conspiracy was deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Suddenly, the phone on Hayes's desk rang. The tone of the call was immediate, its urgency palpable. Judge Hayes, the voice on the other end said, "We need you to come to the office now. It's about Kane. We've just gotten word he's gone. He's disappeared." Everything Hayes thought he knew crumbled in an instant. Robert Kane, the man who had been pulling the strings, the man who had been the source of his betrayal, was gone, vanished without a trace. What had he gotten himself into? What had Kane uncovered? Hayes's entire future was suddenly in jeopardy. The case wasn't about proving his innocence or exposing Kane anymore. It was about survival. There was no turning back now. The storm was coming, and Hayes was right in the eye of it. As he grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his mind raced. Whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated everything, was playing a game far beyond him, and they had already taken their first move. The real battle had just begun. The city lights blurred past Hayes as he sped toward the courthouse. His heart was a drumbeat of urgency, his thoughts a jumble of confusion, anger, and fear. The phone call had confirmed his worst fears. Robert Kane had disappeared. But what did that mean? Was Kane running, trying to escape the fallout? Or was he taken? Was this all part of the larger conspiracy? Hayes didn't know who he could trust anymore. Everyone around him seemed to be tangled up in this web of lies and power plays. And now, with Kane gone, Hayes had no choice but to follow the clues wherever they might lead. When he reached the courthouse, he was greeted by the tense atmosphere of the night shift. Everyone seemed to be moving faster, whispering in hushed voices as though the building itself was holding its breath. Hayes's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Aaron Thompson. He picked up immediately. "Aaron," he said, his voice low, "what's going on? Where is Kane?" "I don't know," Aaron replied, her voice tight with worry. "But I've been hearing some things. Word is Kane's been removed from the equation, taken out. I'm starting to think he wasn't the mastermind after all." Hayes's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" "I think you've been played," Aaron said, her voice cracking slightly. "There's a bigger game at work here, Hayes. A game that we don't fully understand. I just got a call from someone I trust, someone in a high place. They said Kane was a pawn. The real power, the real people behind this have made their move. And now you're next." Hayes entered his office, his mind racing with the weight of Aaron's words. He glanced at the security footage in his office, trying to steady himself. What if this was all part of a trap? What if Kane's disappearance was just the first step in something far worse? He sat at his desk, staring at the phone, the last connection to everything that had just unraveled. He thought about calling back Aaron, figuring out his next move. But something made him stop. The door creaked open slowly, and Hayes looked up, startled. A man in a suit, unfamiliar but with an aura of authority, stepped into the room. Hayes's instinct screamed danger, but he said nothing. The man's cold eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, like the calm before a storm. "You must be Judge Hayes," the man said finally, his voice cold and clipped. Hayes stood up slowly, his mind racing. "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "Let's just say I'm someone who has a vested interest in your future, or rather, what remains of it." The man stepped forward, pulling a file from his jacket. He dropped it on the desk with a sharp thud, and Hayes hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were photographs, documents, and names, some of which Hayes recognized, others he didn't. But one thing was clear: the web of corruption ran far deeper than he had ever imagined. "You've been digging, Hayes," the man continued. "You've been poking around in places that you shouldn't. But now it's time for you to stop. Hayes's stomach churned. He recognized this for what it was, a threat, but the cold calm of the man's demeanor was unnerving. Hayes's instincts screamed at him to act, but something about the situation told him to be careful. "I'm not stopping," Hayes said, his voice firm. "I'm going to expose what's happening. All of it." The man's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was the smile of someone who knew they had already won. "We'll see about that," he said softly. "But make no mistake, Judge Hayes, there's no coming back from this. You've made enemies in places you can't even fathom. This isn't just about your career anymore. It's about your life." The man turned to leave, but Hayes's mind was racing faster now than ever before. The game had shifted once again. It was clear to him now. This wasn't just a courtroom drama or a political scandal. This was something far darker. This was about power, manipulation, and control. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't going to stop until they had taken everything from him. Erin called again, her voice urgent. "Hayes, get out of there. This isn't over. They're closing in on you. You need to disappear, at least for now." But Hayes couldn't leave. He had no choice but to stay and fight. If he ran, he'd be admitting defeat. And he couldn't let that happen, not when the stakes were this high. "I can't leave, Erin," he said, determination hardening his voice. "I'm in this too deep now. I'll finish it." "Finish it?" "Hayes." Erin's voice cracked, but Hayes cut her off. "I have to do this. I don't know who's behind all of this, but I'll find out. I'll bring them down." Erin paused, then, with a heavy sigh, replied, "Be careful. They won't go easy on you." As Hayes turned back to the files, something caught his eye. A name buried in the pile of documents the man had left on his desk. A name he didn't recognize, William Carson. The name wasn't just a random entry. It was a connection that ran through everything. Carson's name appeared alongside other high-profile figures, including some he had crossed paths with in the past. This was the lead he had been searching for. With his heart pounding, Hayes called Erin back, his mind already working through the next steps. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. William Carson was the key to everything, and he would stop at nothing to find out who Carson was and how deep the conspiracy really went. But as he stood up, the door to his office swung open again, and two men stepped inside. They were tall, dressed in dark suits, and their cold eyes were trained on Hayes. Their presence was overwhelming, their intentions clear. Before Hayes could react, one of the men spoke. "It's over, Judge. Time to come with us." The walls were closing in on Hayes, but this time there would be no more running. No more playing by the rules. The game had changed again. Whoever was behind all this, whoever had orchestrated his fall from grace, would stop at nothing to make sure he paid the price. But Hayes had made his decision. He wasn't going down without a fight. The investigation wasn't over yet. If he had to burn everything to the ground to uncover the truth, he would do it. And with that thought, as the men closed in around him, Hayes knew one thing for certain. The final battle was just beginning. Hayes stood at the precipice of everything he had worked for, the truth hanging in the balance. What had started as a betrayal, a sudden fall from grace, had become something much larger, something that threatened to consume not just his career, but his entire life. With each step forward, the stakes had grown higher, and now, standing in the face of the unknown, he knew there was no turning back. The conspiracy that had been lurking in the shadows was no longer a secret. It had dragged him in, forced his hand, and now he was part of it. But he would not be a pawn, not anymore. The people behind it all might have underestimated him, but Hayes was ready to show them just how far he was willing to go to get to the truth. In the end, it wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about something bigger, the truth. Whatever the cost, Hayes knew this was a battle worth fighting. As the door closed behind him, Hayes stepped into the darkness of what lay ahead, ready to face whatever challenges would come his way. The story for him was far from over.